Hello everybody, welcome to Module 5. A quick reminder that this is actually Chapter 6 in the book, not Chapter 5 in the book. We actually flip those in the way I present them in the class. So we're actually doing Chapter 6 this week, but it's Module 5. Alright, so this chapter slash module will focus on what it takes to become a conservation officer. So just like any job, the position of a conservation officer has some minimum requirements that must be met to be eligible to be hired for that position. So what those requirements have changed over time, and they also vary from agency to agency. In the past, they had things such as height and weight requirements, but since that time, those have been deemed to be discriminatory and is pretty much gone from any kind of pre-hiring requirements. But there's other items such as education, physical fitness standards, written tests, background checks, checks on prior drug use. They have tattoo policies, and then also there's pre-employment training, and all those things, how much they're required, who requires them, those things have all varied over time. So for example, when I was preparing to apply for a conservation officer position in 1999, the department in which I was applying had pretty strict no visible tattoos, no prior offenses such as DUIs, and were really pretty strict about prior drug use. And that was very similar to many departments at the time. So if you had those things, the odds of you being hired were greatly reduced. And all of those kinds of policies have been modified over the last 25-ish years, especially as we got into some of these hiring crunch kind of problems, especially law enforcement wide. So today, in the environment we're in today, pretty much every type of law enforcement agency is having trouble recruiting potential officers. And conservation law enforcement really is no exception, but this really hasn't always been the case. Because of the specialty aspect of conservation law enforcement and the limited number of available positions, conservation law enforcement agencies really had a fairly robust number of applicants and didn't have to do a whole lot in the way of recruiting because there's these kind of natural motivations that applicants have for becoming conservation officers that's quite a bit different from traditional police agencies. But one thing that has been occurring over the last about 25-ish years or more is, like everyone else, conservation agencies have been trying to become more diverse. But while they really in the past didn't have any problem with recruiting, recruiting diversity has been potentially more difficult for conservation agencies than even for traditional police agencies, because a lot of the people that want to be conservation officers, a lot of them are from rural backgrounds where they have this background in hunting and fishing. And hunting and fishing traditionally are white male dominated activities. Now, that's not to say that women and people of color don't participate in those activities. It's just that white males participate in those activities at much greater numbers than everyone else. And because many women and people of color don't have a lot of experience with hunting and fishing, it's much more difficult to recruit them to be conservation officers. An experience with hunting and fishing is certainly not, you don't have to have that to be a conservation officer, but having experience with it and having an understanding of hunting and fishing and what all that entails certainly makes it much easier for someone to be successful as a conservation officer. All right, so the requirements that someone must meet to be eligible to be a conservation officer or law enforcement in general are what are known as bona fide occupational qualifications. Now, a bona fide occupational qualification is a qualification that can be proven to be intrinsically important to a particular job rather than just a qualification that is used to kind of differentially exclude candidates. For example, requiring a candidate to be a certain height and weight is not a bona fide occupational qualification because people of varying sizes can effectively do the conservation officer job. And this type of qualification would exclude most women from being eligible because women generally are not as physically large as men. Now, there's some other common pre-employment standards such as age requirements, vision, physical agility, strength, endurance, And agencies also commonly will require someone to pass a written test as well as a background check. Most also require at least one in-person interview, and some also include psychological tests, polygraph examinations. Now, which of these are required and how much departments weigh the different aspects to them really varies from state to state and agency to agency. So age requirements, those are pretty standard for law enforcement agencies. Most agencies require applicants to be 21 years of age. Now, that's not everybody, but many of them do. And then what happens after that really varies. Okay, so some have thresholds on how long people can apply, others don't. Okay, so some of them say you have to apply by a certain date or a certain age, other ones don't. For example, to work in the federal government, you have to apply by the time you're 38 because they require you to have 20 years to retire, and they have a minimum retirement age of 58. Okay, so and other agencies also have mandatory retirement ages, but others don't. Vision is another kind of interesting requirement. As the book says, some states have pretty stringent sight requirements, but fortunately for me, Missouri didn't. So Missouri's requirement was just that your vision could be corrected to 20/20. There was no minimum uncorrected vision. It was just it had to be able to be corrected. And then over the years, there's been this whole bunch of debate about what does LASIK surgery mean? Okay, so as that became more popular and accessible, they really had to kind of grapple with what that meant for those kind of requirements. Does that count as 20/20 uncorrected? Because that's very different from contacts or glasses, which could be knocked off your face or it could be lost. So they really had to try to figure out, what did that mean, for people that had this surgery? Does that count as the same as someone who has uncorrected 20/20 vision, like just naturally? So how they've looked at that has really kind of changed over time too. One of the most kind of controversial requirements are these physical agility, strength, and endurance testings. So in traditional policing research, these requirements have really been found to be kind of a poor reflection of what police actually do. Okay, they've also been found at times to be discriminatory and detrimental to the recruitment of female candidates. So kind of how people had these things framed, at times there were some of these kind of requirements that differentially excluded people, right? But kind of in spite of all these issues, these types of requirements really still exist in some form for many law enforcement agencies. But what's interesting is kind of the work environment of a conservation officer is much different than that from a traditional police officer. And in a lot of ways is a much more physically taxing, type of job for a variety of reasons. Conservation officers are more prone to have to hike long distances over rough terrain, ford streams. A lot of those things that a traditional police officer really wouldn't be doing. Another kind of conservation officer specific thing is that a little over 50% of agencies require a swimming test. Now, most traditional law enforcement agencies don't require a swimming test at all because the odds of a municipal police officer having to actually swim is really pretty low. But for a conservation officer, needing to be able to swim is actually pretty important because conservation officers, spend quite a bit of time either on the water, like a lake, or around the water. Okay, so being able to swim is really pretty important. I used to work a lot on the Mississippi River, and if I got knocked out of my boat or whatever, being able to swim would be, super important. Being able to swim is kind of this real kind of conservation officer kind of requirement that's pretty specific. Written tests have had some controversy about them. So some places use simply a pass-fail test to simply determine whether someone, minimally has the ability to successfully complete academy coursework and perform other duties such as note-taking, report writing. But there's problems with that. If you have a simple pass-fail, because someone who scores a 100 and someone who scores a 60 both pass, right? But obviously there's quite a bit of difference between a 100 and a 60. And how do you differentiate between those people in the hiring process? So the other kind of criticism is that they make the test too easy in order to kind of get this broader group of people, to move on from this written test requirement. So if you make the test more difficult, then you run the risk of eliminating people who could potentially turn out to be really fine officers. And you also run into questions about discriminatory practices at that point as well. So the overwhelming majority of conservation agencies do require some sort of written exam. And many also require a college degree. So the issues with these written exams may lessen when you have higher educational requirements. Oral interviews. Many, if not all, agencies require at least one oral interview. When I went through, I had to do two. There was one on the front end, and then there was one kind of on the back end as well. So this oral interview, at the most basic level, is just to determine if someone has the requisite, kind of oral communication skills to be a conservation officer. Because conservation officers are really like the frontline employees for the natural resources agencies, in their communities, and have to be able to effectively communicate, not only for the law enforcement aspects of that, but they do a lot of other kind of PR work and educational stuff. So being able to orally communicate effectively is also very important. Sometimes these interviews are used to determine if someone has behavioral skills, as well as asking interviewees how they would respond to particular scenarios. So sometimes interviews, especially if there's like a second one, a lot of times the second one is, well, here's these scenarios, what would you do kind of situation. Some agencies also have to do, or have their recruits do, psychological exams. And what these are really varies a lot. Some of them are simply just kind of written exams, while others are conducted in person in more of like an interview kind of style with a licensed professional. So how effective these are really hinges on what type of exam it is. Okay, the in-person exam with a trained professional are generally regarded to be much more effective than simply having recruits take a written test to test their psychological well-being. But pretty much all police agencies, conservation, law enforcement, like any kind of law enforcement, they generally have some type of psychological testing due to issues related to liability. Medical examinations are something that also is used commonly, and virtually every conservation agency has a medical examination. And I had to go through one as well when I was applying to be a conservation officer. And they serve three purposes. To make sure the candidate's physically able to complete law enforcement tasks, ensure officers are not taking banned substances, and that they don't have some underlying medical condition that could lead them to have to be out of work for long periods of time. Because it doesn't do an agency any good to have someone that from the start is not able to work regularly. Then there's also polygraph examinations. Some agencies use them, some of them don't. And the main purpose of these tests is to verify information, that the applicant has provided. Because you'll fill out this huge kind of background check form where they ask all kinds of questions. You have to list all these people, that you've lived with, and like it's pretty extensive. And then they also ask about a lot of other things on there that you have to answer. So oftentimes these polygraph tests are just to check and make sure that someone is being truthful with the information that they have provided to the agency. All right. Another common pre-employment qualification is some sort of educational requirement. Okay, whether that's a high school, graduate from high school, or college degree, or some kind of education plus experience sort of thing. So when you're talking about traditional police, less than 1% of traditional police agencies require a college degree, but 40% of conservation agencies do. Another 26% of conservation agencies require at least an associate's degree. And the main reason this is because of the wide range of duties that are required of conservation officers. Now we could probably have a whole discussion, a whole video just on educational requirements, because there's so much variation because states allow for different types of substitutions for experience. Some require only certain types of degrees, right? So a lot of these agencies are like 4-year degree or 2-year degree in this, or so many hours in this, or military experience, and like there's this whole like kind of either or kind of experience. All right, so if you make it through this kind of long, arduous process of going through the pre-employment stuff, when I applied, it took 6 months. And my understanding is that it's still very similar to that kind of time frame. So when you apply for these kind of jobs, you need to be prepared for this to be kind of a long, drawn-out, kind of arduous process. You end up at the pre-employment training. Okay, so all state-level conservation officers attend some sort of academy, just like traditional law enforcement officers. But the type of academy really varies. There's kind of 3 types of academies that conservation officers attend. About a third of conservation agencies require officers to attend what's basic police academy. A basic police academy, real similar to what a regular law enforcement officer would attend. And then once they graduate, then they do this field training with their agency without any additional academy training at that point. About 20% of agencies run their own conservation-specific academy, and that's the type of academy that I attended in Missouri. Okay, the Missouri Department of Conservation has their own post-certified law enforcement academy. So it incorporates all the required basic police training and then also conservation officer-specific training. But probably the most common type is what Dr. Rossler and I, in our article, have called like the hybrid academy. So under this hybrid model, agencies require recruits to attend the basic police academy, and then they have a series of specific trainings that the agency does prior to them beginning their field training. Okay, so you have some that is just basic law enforcement training and then field training. You have 20% that run their own conservation-specific academy. Then you have this hybrid model where you attend a basic police academy, and then you attend some conservation-specific training that the agency puts on, and then you go and begin your field training. All right, so that's the main 3, but there's always some exceptions to everything, right? So Alaska and Oregon actually organize their officers differently, and they have them under a Department of Public Safety. So because of that, they're considered state troopers in those states. So they attend training with the trooper candidates, and then at some point they're split out, and some go do like the traffic stuff, and then these officers go and do the conservation stuff. And then you have states like Arizona and Colorado that have this biologist enforcement hybrid model. So these officers are really kind of full-blown biologists. So in their job duties, they do a lot of biological work as a regular biologist, but then they also have law enforcement capabilities as well, and they have kind of this hybrid style academy that's specific to that kind of setup that they have. All right, so the end of the chapter talks about federal requirements. In many ways, those are very similar to those of state agencies, but I'm not going to spend much time on them because that would make this video get even longer. So be sure to read that section and understand what's entailed in the selection process and training process of federal conservation officers. All right, with that, I'm going to stop for the week. Be sure you do your assignments for this week. Please complete all the readings and let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you next week.